Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming to this discussion about Made in Great Britain, the 2012 debate. My name is Paul Alger and I'm Director of International Affairs for the UK Fashion and Textile Association. And we have a distinguished panel of speakers who are going to give you their views, hopefully, on how important or not it is for them to be supporting, looking at, writing about, talking about products made in the UK. In no particular order, we have Richard Dodd, who's Head of Media at the British Retail Consortium. We have Rosie Wolfenden, at the end, Co-founder and Managing Director of Tatty Design. Victoria White, Editor of Company Magazine. And Victoria McQuillan, owner of Think Boutique. Thank you very much for coming today. And what I thought we'd do first of all is just to start off asking the speakers if they will give us just a little snapshot of what their views are about how important it is to manufacture in the UK. But before I do that, I'd just like to give a couple of thoughts about maybe some of the things that we might like to get out of the next half an hour, and really to try and work out whether the view, the consensus is that the resurgence of UK manufacturing or the resurgence of interest in UK manufacturing, whether it's a temporary resurgence, whether it's a flash in the pan, whether it's something which people think should be a more long-term phenomenon. I'd like to find out whether by the end of this session Mary Portas and her kinky knickers have made a long-term contribution to this dispute, this argument, I'm sorry. I'd also like to mention, before I forget, that UKFT, the organisation I work for, has a Let's Make It Here website attached to our website, which we see a lot of interest. There's a lot of interest in this subject, but a lot of retailers and a lot of designers and manufacturers often say that there isn't the real support for UK manufactured prices at retail. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that. And finally, what future there is for Made in the UK and how interested are consumers and readers about this subject. So if I can start with you, please, would you like to tell us what your views are on Made in the UK?
Hello. Well, we make the majority of our pieces in the UK. We make jewellery. We've got 2 studios in Britain, one in Kent, one in London, and everything's laser cut, but it's all micro-manufacturing, and it's really important to us because it gives us ultimate control, really, to make sure that there's an assurance of quality that you couldn't necessarily get overseas. We make, you know, small runs, and it just means that there's a sort of, the customers, they really care about it, and our customers, one of the first things they often say in the shop is, where do you make this? Because they expect you to say China, or they expect you to say overseas, but when we say we make it around the corner, they're really interested, and it kind of brings back a sense of quality and craftsmanship. So yes, it's important.
Richard, how important is it for you in your work?
Well, the British Retail Consortium represents, of course, major retailers, so you know, I'm not here talking on behalf of the very worthy but small operators like you. So, of course, the major retailers, yes, they recognise the importance of supporting UK. I think UK, you know, designers and UK marketers more than actually UK manufacturing. Of course, some of what they sell is made in the UK, and that tends to be high-end fashion, and also the instant fashion where timeliness is really, really important. But for that massive products, particularly at the value end, of course, a lot of that, maybe most of it, is made abroad where costs are that much lower. And you know, I was going to say I don't want to be, but perhaps I do want to be a bit controversial, you know, by saying that I do think for the majority of customers who shop in those big stores, where something is made is not anywhere near the top of the list of factors that they're considering when they make their buying decisions. Other things are much, much more important. So I'm not saying that the big retailers are not supporting the UK economy or supporting elements of the UK fashion industry, because they certainly are. But I don't think we should be getting too exercised about this notion that somehow basic manufacturing of everyday clothing products ought to be brought back to Britain.
And Victoria, you have a store by the name of Think Boutique. Can you tell us a little bit about that store and how important UK products are in your product mix?
Yeah, we sell online and it's all ethical fashion, women's wear, clothing and accessories. And since spring/summer 11, we made the decision to start stocking products that are made in the UK solely. And as a retailer, that means that we have great control and a great relationship with our suppliers. We've been able to do things like go to the factory, see the clothing being made, and also pass that on to the customers who are really interested. Obviously, the kind of customer that we're dealing with is already interested in where their clothing comes from, but for them to know that it's been made in the UK is the icing on the cake, basically. And we were able to make a video of the clothing being made, so you can see your very dress go through the sewing machine onto the website, and you can have it in your hand. And to build up great relationships with the brands, because basically they're there, and we're able to go and talk to them and see it all being made. So it's been really, really good. The made in the UK stuff.
Excellent. And the other Victoria.
Well, the readers of Company magazine are between 16 and 26, and they're very, very interested in fashion. And whilst I think they would like to have an attitude of this has been bought in the UK, it's been made in the UK, the truth is that they want value fashion and they want lots of it. And it's really quite hard to get that, as Richard said, within the sort of bigger fashion chains in the UK. That's not to say they're not interested in the notion. And also I think very much for them, these are girls who really want to work in fashion a lot of the time. And it isn't just manufacturing. I think it's important that we look at all different aspects of the fashion industry within the UK and don't talk solely about manufacturing, because there's so many other ways that the fashion industry makes money within the UK.
Could you elaborate on some of those for us?
Well, marketing, PR, now you've got a whole series of jobs based entirely around content production, social networking. There are huge amounts of jobs in the digital aspect. If you look at something like ASOS, this is one of the biggest brands in the UK, which also ships overseas. It's enormous. Now that doesn't necessarily manufacture in the UK, but what it does is have a huge office in Camden. And employs hundreds and hundreds of people, thousands probably. And that's all the good stuff. That's the good stuff moving forward, and that we're very good at in the UK.
My next question, I think, is for Rosie and Victoria, probably. How closely linked is the ethical fashion discussion linked to made in UK? I mean, we know it's possible to manufacture ethically outside the UK, but how much of an issue is the made in the UK for the ethical fashion side? Would you like to go first?
Well, I think, as I said, I think the kind of customer who is shopping ethically is probably the kind of customer who'd be interested in knowing where it came from in the first place. So I think that there's like a double appeal there for a customer. Possibly, as Victoria said, the girls who are more interested in like the value and all those, the kind of the fashion, who don't really mind so much where it came from, is a different kind of customer base. We find though that our product speaks first, and it's always got to be the product before where it came from, because you can make something in the UK, but it's got to appeal to the customer. They've got to like it before they'll actually put their money in and buy it. I think that's the thing. Is not just saying this is made in the UK so you should buy it, it's saying this is a really gorgeous product that's good quality, that's on trend, and did you know it's made in the UK?
For us, we didn't initially start Tatty Devine wanting it to be ethical. We started in '99, and we just wanted to be able to keep everything under our control. Sorry, excuse me. So making it ourselves meant that we had ultimate control and quality, but it also meant that we could make sure the craftsmanship was there, something that we sort of created ourselves and we've taught to all of our skilled workforce. So it's a case of employing local people, and it's actually, it has a sort of, it's like a micro sort of organism, we do everything, but it is important. It does become ethical because it does employ local people, and it does keep the craftsmanship quite central to what we do.
Which then picks up something that from your reader's point of view might be quite interesting. You've done a lot of work with Graduate Fashion Week. How important is it to have flexible, local, accessible manufacturing for graduates or younger fashion designer companies? Can they survive without it?
Well, I think, as I say, the big retailers actually do employ a lot at design level. In terms of the manufacturing, it's difficult because I'm not sure how many fashion graduates know and understand what those careers actually entail. And that's something that maybe we could work on more in the UK, is actually showing the breadth of different types of jobs within manufacturing. So I think the challenge is, for a lot of young girls going into the industry, they do kind of want the sort of front-end glory jobs. And it's working out a way to sort of entice them possibly into the different types of jobs that exist that they might not even have thought about.
I totally agree. I mean, I think it's not a very glamorous, it doesn't sound glamorous, but at the end of the day, there is a whole contingent of people that love making, and it's encouraging that and not losing sight of it. I mean, as a country, we've totally lost this industry, and we're never going to get it back. But I do think through micro manufacturing, there's chances of sort of re-educating and sort of kind of encouraging those skills in people, which could just otherwise get completely lost.
Found as well that ironically there's a huge move back towards crafting for girls who are very into fashion, because it's the best way to have a unique look of your own. So what we've seen is that the younger end, they're very much into making things and sort of customizing their existing clothes. So there is that kind of thirst and appetite there. It's just how we can harness it to sort of show them what they could move into.
I just wanted to say, we all remember, I bet a lot of people watched the Mary Porter's programmes earlier on in the year about people sitting down making knickers again in this country, and she was putting that forward as if that was something that we should aspire to, or something which I think you're hinting at, that somehow we should be sad that we've lost those really basic manufacturing jobs. Do we actually really want to have big numbers of employees in this country again, sitting sort of Coronation Street style in sewing rooms, knocking out those low-value products and not earning a great deal for it? I would say actually no, we don't. It's those high-end, well-paid, high-value jobs that you're talking about that we ought to be aspiring to. And I think you've got a good point earlier on, actually, which is that we are world leaders in retailing in this country. And let's not forget, whatever products we're talking about fashion here, but it could be anything. The UK is a global leader, a genuine world leader when it comes to quality retailing. And of course, the internet means, and we're leaders in that for sure, the internet means that we're aiming now at a worldwide audience, and there are lots of jobs and opportunities, and lots of opportunities for wealth creation that come off the back of that.
I do think that we in the UK, we have a certain set of skills. Like, we can say that, like, the other, maybe in third world countries, wherever things are being made in mass, that's fine. But here we could be making more interesting things. It could be like 4 people in a room sewing small amounts of things. We could still be providing jobs without it having to be mass market, I think. And I think that's probably more what the demand is for interesting clothes that are a bit different. And I don't think we're suggesting that we should start.
No, I was implying that Mary Porter's and the thrust of her programmes earlier this year were all about that.
Yeah, but I don't think that's where it can go. I think it's more about independence.
I wanted to raise the question of labelling, because you talked about made in Britain, and obviously that's the thrust of what we're on about here, isn't it? What should the rules be about labelling? Because some, certainly in Europe, have suggested that there ought to be regulations in much the same way as there are around food for non-food products, including clothing, saying which country it was made in. Now, our members at the British Retail Consortium are certainly opposed to that, and very much in favour of retailers and manufacturers having the opportunity to put made in Britain on a product of their own accord if they think it's to their advantage and will be useful information for customers. But I don't think we need legislation on that that's going to require that as some sort of legal obligation. But maybe you do. I just throw that out.
Well, it's one of the very big hot potatoes, certainly of our industry, and certainly the organisation that I work for, that spends a lot of time working with Brussels and British government, has tended to take a neutral view on compulsory origin labelling in fashion. But if you look in the supermarkets in the UK and most other countries, then you can work out where your bananas and your apples and your grapes come from. I can understand why certain consumers would like to know where their fashion comes from. And we also talk a lot about food miles. Obviously, not knowing where things come from prevents us effectively talking about fashion miles. I mean, I don't know whether that's an important part of this discussion as well, that a large part of the impetus for bringing merchandise manufacturing back to the UK is based often around the fact that it costs an absolute fortune to bring it back in from China. I mean, is that a big consideration for you in your work?
I think so. I mean, I think the localness of a product can be very, for many consumers it really does matter, and they like the fact that it hasn't come from miles and miles away, and they like the fact that it's not from a high volume production one. They like the fact that it's got a specialness to it, and I think it is a niche thing. I think it is, but I do think there are consumers out there who want quality, and they don't want it to have travelled all the way around the world, and they want it to have a significance and to have be ethical in those ways, because these things do matter, and I think the population are being educated around those matters. So yeah, I think it does matter.
I think probably for a lot of consumers there's just a lot of confusion, because most consumers won't know which brands, particularly on the high street, are British brands. I mean, you probably know Zara is Spanish, but I don't know, maybe not. But things like French Connection, I don't think a lot of people know that's actually British. We were talking about Superdry before, is a great British brand based in Cheltenham. I suspect most consumers think that's Japanese or American. So it would be great, I think, if there was some way for consumers to actually know just a little bit more about it, and then maybe they would make a choice based not just upon, I think we've kind of covered the whole sort of sweatshops and mass production, and most people feel bad about that. But they don't feel necessarily as bad about the fashion miles thing, and that's a really new kind of angle to look at.
We find with information that we give a lot, we're online, so we have that opportunity to label everything with a lot of information. But I think we've also done pop-up stores, so I've met customers and seen them shopping face to face, and the thing is that it might be there on the label, but they won't necessarily always read that. So I think it's just giving them that option of having the information there for them, and then they can choose how to use that rather than saying that you must do this or that. But I think that making it sort of I find that customers will come in and they'll look at the product. I've said this already, but they'll look at the product first, and then they'll look at the information. But I think having some kind of set labelling like you do in the supermarket does make sense, because then it's quick and it's easy and it's right there for them.
So we have some opposing views. That's always very nice, very reassuring. Is there anything else that we should be doing, therefore, if one takes that point, to actually make sure that consumers understand better what it is that they're buying and where their fashion comes from? If we take out of it the compulsory origin labelling, but is there something else that we should be doing as an industry, as a group of industries, if you include retail, to actually make sure that consumers are empowered to make decisions which they can then be responsible for ultimately, because we're all responsible for our decisions? Stunned silence.
I suppose that's what Mary Portas has been trying to do, although I think maybe a little ambitious, because we're not going to turn the economy around in 6 months. But I think we're on a journey where all these things become more and more important, and as consumers do become more knowledgeable about it, they do start to matter. And I think this trend to actually go for quality and smaller volume rather than, there is a big contingent who would much rather buy something that's a bit more money, but they feel that it's more valid, I suppose. It's supporting the British economy, and it's something that not everybody on the high street is going to be wearing because there's less of them, and these things just start to matter, I think.
Effectively, we're moving from buying less but better.
Yeah, quality over quantity, essentially.
And do we think that actually is perhaps more the trend than just the fact of buying something because it's made in the UK? Is that a...
But that's only part of the market, isn't it? And, it's clearly it's the part that you work successfully towards, and that's obviously great. But for a lot of people, it is about value, and so it's about low prices. Coupled with things like obviously being very, very fashionable and being fit for the purpose, because value is not just about low prices, but price is tremendously important to an awful lot of people. I just wanted to say that I'm not sure that anybody here is actually really suggesting it, but there's often this kind of implication that somehow, in order to have made a fashion product abroad and to be able to sell it in this country at a very affordable price, somebody somewhere has suffered or lost out or been exploited. And you know, usually the implication is that somebody in a factory in the Far East. Well, you know, that just isn't the case, because certainly for major retailers, they work through something called the Ethical Trading Initiative, and they scrutinise very, very closely the factories that are supplying them. And you've got to remember that the people in those countries who work in those factories are doing those jobs by choice, and usually they're better jobs than the alternatives, and better paying jobs than the alternatives available to them over there. So they're actually benefiting from their employers having access to our high-value, high-paying markets in this country. They're not losing out.
I do think for the majority of consumers, it's something they'd possibly like, the idea of spending more on something that's British made, but at the same time, if there's an Italian designer that they really lust after, you know, if there's a bag, they want some shoes, I'm not sure that British is the thing that would swing it. As I say, certainly for my readers, it would be about what is the most fashionable, what is the most kind of lust-worthy product out there at the moment. And if it's a Marbury bag, great. You know, if it's a Balenciaga bag, not so great.
I was going to try and probe a little bit more on whether it's actually possible for retailers to sell more based on the fact that something is made in a certain place, because I think one of you touched upon that earlier on. I mean, how in your business, obviously you make a great of the fact that you're buying a lot from the UK. Does that actually help you to sell fashion, do you find? Is it drive people to your site?
I think it does to a certain extent, but part of it is for my benefit as well, is to do with what goes on the other side, to do with my relationships with the brands and my sourcing of the products and all that kind of thing, as well as obviously then on the other side selling that on to the customer, if that makes sense. And I think it does help to generate interest in the brands, and people, strangely, it also brings people in from overseas, because a lot of people overseas are really interested in the UK, and obviously at the minute we're the talking points of everything, so that also helps. Just to sort of, it gives us an identity as well. I find that just saying we're an ethical women's wear site wasn't really enough, so I can now say, and we're made in the UK. It just sort of cements our identity for the customer.
It's been very interesting for me over the years when we've taken companies to international trade shows and to trade missions, that a lot of UK consumers are not always that aware of a lot of the UK brands, but actually particularly those that are either very obviously designed in the UK or often made in the UK, when you take them off to certain countries like Japan, Korea, for example, the United States, that they are perceived as being better because they're not made in China, they're not made in India. I mean, is that something, again, Rosie, in your experience, that has helped in your exports?
Definitely. There's we sell a lot to Japan, Europe, America, Australia, and Korea. The Far East is sort of really growing, but they're very interested in the Britishness, and it's a very, when it comes down to brands and being a British brand, there's elements about, our creativity, the originality, the authenticity, all the things which rise to the surface as being great attributes to what we do, they all stem from a Britishness. And, that's not applicable to every brand on the high street. This is something quite niche, and I think it's definitely export markets really appreciate it. And, I mean, they're amazed that we're making in Britain. That's the general reaction, And I would disagree with what you'd said earlier, because I do think, yes, in China, for example, in the factories, they are working because they want to, but we are taking advantage of the fact that they work incredibly hard at very low rates, which I do feel that it's not necessarily a great situation. And China's getting more expensive, so there is actually a very realistic opportunity here that we can do more manufacturing here at a decent rate that will get the price that people want.
I think that's an important point as well, because you talk about China's become very expensive and cost of fuel is expensive. So there is this trend to bring things back closer to the UK, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it always comes back to the UK. Turkey and various other countries have done extremely well. This is not just a made in UK, this is a made in Europe, made closer to home, which brings back to the point you were making earlier on about control, flexibility. If I can throw into that authenticity, perhaps for certain key customers.
Closer to home it is. Everything just becomes much easier. It becomes much easier to solve problems. It becomes much easier to make the product as good as you possibly can, to get the quality as high as you possibly can, to make sure the employees are being paid as much as they can, to make sure they're having they work in a good environment that they enjoy. I mean, work should be enjoyable. It shouldn't be, it's part of all of our lives. So all of those things go into a product and start making that product talk a slightly different language, which I think a certain customer really does appreciate.
Before we move on, can I just ask by a show of hands how many of you people, presumably that most of you are retailers, you do have to work at these things as well, how many of you buy from the UK on a regular basis, just by a show of hands? About 25%. For how many of you would it be important? Is it something that you find interesting that you would buy from the UK if you could afford to, if you felt your consumers would? A little bit more, I would say. Yes, interesting.
Because I guess it's worth making the point as well that everyone here is running a business, so unfortunately, until the manufacturing becomes more affordable in the UK, you're in a kind of chicken and egg situation, because retailers have to make money, so and also pass that on to consumers, who we do have to think about in all of this.
I think people were also saying that it's driven by customers, and that's one of the most important things, isn't it? I'm forever saying that when I'm talking about retailers and defending them against a whole range of different criticisms. The people who have all the power in retailing are the customers, through the choices that they make about where they spend their money and what they spend their money on, and that they will decide how much, and they will show very clearly through their pounds. They will show how much made in Britain or any other factor actually matters to them.
You were going to say something.
Yeah, the only other thing I was thinking was the whole thing about sweatshops and all that is very negative, obviously, but it's not just about saying, well, these clothes are bad, these clothes are good. It's more about sort of looking at the positives of made in Britain, and not saying if you buy this, you're bad, and if you buy this, you're good. It's just saying, have you thought about this, like made in Britain, and added value, rather than just saying, like, don't do that, do this kind of thing. That was what was going around my head.
That's probably quite a good place to leave it, I think, if you are happy. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming to listen to us today. If you'd like, if there are any questions that anybody has a burning desire to ask, I'm afraid there isn't a mic in the audience, but if there is anybody that would like to ask us a question, then I'm sure some of us will. But are you happy, Jerome? You go on, you go and take some questions. I can't, because I've got a fixed head now.
It's not really a question, but I think it's more of a contribution I have. I don't like the idea of us thinking that maybe the Far East is a sweatshop and all of that. I want to believe that one of the reasons why things are cheaper there may also be because they pay less tax. Obviously, if you're going to get that same value here, it will be for much more, because even the tax the person has to pay will be more. So that also informs the price, and not necessarily because it's a sweatshop. Also, they have a different working productivity level than we do. We're becoming more and more lazy. We don't do much more with our time as they do. But instead of us seeing things the way they are, we say it's a sweatshop and all of that, but no, they're actually being more productive, paid the right wages, because they don't pay as much taxes they do over here.
Very good point. Thank you.
And I was denying really strongly that major retailers use sweatshops at all. And I think the point about wages is, of course, it's very easy to see it in the context of how much we earn and how much we need to fund our expensive lives in this country, meet our high costs. Obviously, you need to see wages in those countries in the context of the cost regimes that those people are facing, and they can often be very different.
Victoria, there's a gentleman over here that's raised his hand, if you don't mind. I'm sorry about that. You did volunteer.
To declare a vested interest, I actually work with Nancy D, which is the British fashion manufacturer.
With
Nancy D. there's always a cut-off. When you have an item of clothing that costs £10, obviously there are distribution costs, promotion costs, staffing costs, retailing costs, shipping costs. So there is a point beneath which you can't really go whilst being confident that it's all produced ethically and effectively and so on. And I can see within a retailing body and a media position and so on, the tip of the iceberg in the industry in terms of promotion, marketing and retailing is very important. But within the industry, it's the tip of the iceberg. There are an awful lot of jobs and money for the economy to be made within the manufacture and the production. There are a lot of highly skilled workforces that, before the exodus of manufacture, still exist and are still retraining and setting up in cooperatives and so on. So British manufacture isn't necessarily small and craft, also extends beyond that to I think Mary Porter's set a fairly sort of twee niche, very good for television. You mentioned Coronation Street and so on. It's a little glib to write off British manufacturing in that breath. So within the cost benefit, would you say that spending money with companies that pay all of their taxes, pay wages, pay staff, have facilities, have plants and so on in the country is actually quite a positive benefit to the industry, as well as just funding the front sexy end of the industry and spending all of our money perhaps elsewhere?
I think that was directed to you, Richard, that one.
Again.
As a retailer, why is it?
My point earlier on was that what we need in this country is the high value, high tech, high earning parts of the industry, and we shouldn't be too upset that the basic end, a lot of the basic end, has gone abroad. Although, as you quite rightly said, costs in many of those countries, including China, as they become more prosperous, are going up, and the balance is tipping back.
Any other thoughts on that one?
I think it's really important, and I agree with your comment on Mary Porter's, because it isn't all like that, and it's a substantial part of our economy, and it hasn't disappeared. It is there. It just, it would be good for people to invest back into it, I think.
Travelling around the world, it's often frustrating when you see somebody that says, well, do you really have a UK fashion industry anymore? And they say, well, actually, we take 300 companies to Paris Fashion Week every season. It's the largest national group that go to Paris Fashion Week from any country, including the home country. So yes, we do have a very strong and very vibrant fashion industry, and you're all part of it. So I think it is very important. We often do ourselves down and say, well, actually, we're not very good. We're very good at designing, but we can't manufacture. And yet I know up and down the country there's some very good niche manufacturing places, manufacturing for some very, very high-profile luxury companies. They're not allowed to talk about it because that's what it says in their contracts, but it doesn't mean to say they're not bringing valuable money back into the UK and creating good jobs. Have we got another question up there?
Yes, I'm from America, so I guess we're pretty oversaturated with Chinese goods, as you guys know. But I have been paying attention to what London has been bringing to the fashion industry and how they're developing their market and how organic it is. And I feel like it's something that America is trying to learn again. But what is your, that's the biggest strong point you have. It is very organic. Can you give me your stance on that and selling to America and bringing your kind of little boutique-y, trendy things to New York, LA, Atlanta, all those things? I'm sure you have it there, but just give your stance, because I feel like it's just a market that is a lot bigger than the UK. I mean, no offense, but it is. So.
So you mean in terms of the fact that actually the way we do things over here is quite organic, and that's something we can take abroad as a thing in itself? Is that what you mean? Yeah, I mean, I think everywhere we sell to really appreciates the organicness nature of what we do, because we started from nothing, we've built it up, we're a small company, but we do sell all over the world, and I think, yeah,
Didn't hear that one. You might need to have the
Can you
microphone back for
have
that.
the microphone back?
I think you make that a part of your brand, like to make it feel like, okay, we are an organic brand, and you can market it to places like, pretend like you're a food industry. You're marketing to like a Whole Foods.
No, it's absolutely. It's a great marketing tool because people pay attention and are interested. It's not something that can be applied to the really large brands, but I think a lot of large brands are actually trying to make themselves out to be smaller brands, actually. I think that this sort of organic, small handmadeness is something that people are trying to replicate, and then it isn't very authentic. But I think if you have that, if it is authentic, and then it's a great selling point.
I think also Britain's really hot at the moment, and that whole sort of street style vibe that comes up from East London, all that kind of vibe is so peculiarly British. It doesn't really exist anywhere else in the world. So I think that's something that we've all kind of capitalised on probably, and it doesn't exist in the States because it's so huge. You know. So.
We have like the Row, and we have like people that are brand name people that have done that. But we're not as big as you guys are yet, anyway.
Have we got any more questions? Anybody else with their hand up, especially right down the other end there? I'm sure there was one. I can see one right at the end, I think. No? Well, look, thank you very much. I hope you found that useful. I hope you found it enjoyable. I certainly have found it very useful. I think we've all learned something. I'm very pleased to see that we've got some opposing views, because that's the thing that makes them interesting. If I could ask you to bring your hands together and thank our group of panelists for their time, and thank you very much.